I get the impression that, Jeff, that devices are currently using real-world evidence to a greater extent than perhaps your colleagues. Am I correct in that?
Yes, and I think that's in part to certain important differences between drugs and devices as well, but yes.
Jacqueline, what would you say are the biggest challenges facing the use of real-world evidence at the present time?
Well, I think I touched on some of them. Obviously, we need to understand the data and how it's going to be used, if it's prospective, and there's some verification and validation. If it's going to be retrospective, how do we know that you're getting what you said? And obviously, we talked a lot about designs. I mean, we understand randomization, and it has great power in getting rid of unknown confounders. There's been a lot of progress in looking at observational studies, and we're taking a very logic approach and doing some research here and trying to learn how do those methods work, in what situations might we be able to rely on them, for what endpoints, when are they good studies. I mean, we know that certain people have talked about sort of the harder endpoints, maybe that's where, or today it was raised, well, if you're going to have to go to a hospital for something, that probably allows us to have 2 checks on the data, right? You're going to be hospitalized, and maybe we can get your EHR linked, and we have another verification source. And I know that, we're developing our framework, we're thinking about our guidances, and I know there's always sort of a chicken and egg kind of thing going on, is, you're waiting for our guidance, we're waiting for you to come in to inform our guidances. So we're also trying to engage, not only in these forums, but in sort of smaller groups to talk about potential studies and what might be the, opportunities in this space.
So I will sort of say ditto to everything Jacqueline said. I'll just emphasize, I think some of the big challenges are with data. I think probably like the biggest thing that jumps out at me as far as a challenge is bias. And so as we think about moving from this environment of randomized controlled trials to other types of data, whether they're observational covers a lot of different types of data, big databases, registries, and that kind of thing. What sort of biases are we introducing into the system? And as far as quality of the data, so it gets to reliability of the data, relevance that Jeff had mentioned. So I think quality of data is another sort of big issue. So missing data and information. Can we capture accurately the exposure to the product? And then can we capture the outcome and ascertain that properly? So in our product area, sometimes we have challenges in doing either one or both of those things. So I think those are kind of the big challenges. And I think as we sort of talk about data, to get sort of echo Jeff's point about linkage of data, I think is really critical. So I think one of the challenges that we have, like within using these large medical databases, registries, and a variety of different types of data, is how do we link all of those different forms of data? Because we've got to be able to do that. We can't even do that well, though, among our databases. So I think we have challenges linking, Sentinel data partners. So people are covered for 2 years, and then they move to another insurer, and we sort of lose track of them. And so I think we need to do better job at sort of being able to link just within the databases, but also these disparate other sources of important information too. And I'll stop there.
Do you accept what I was trying to put forward about this concept of regulatory grade real-world evidence? There's real-world evidence, and then there's a super level.
I think that's a great point, because I think, one of our concerns is, it's got to be we've got to have a higher standard, because published studies don't always meet higher standards that are useful for regulatory purposes and decision making. So we've got to have, again, that higher quality of data, the higher level of methods. I mean, methods are big in this as well. And so, but I'll also echo Denise's point, which was, if you're coming into FDA or thinking about doing a submission to FDA and product development, early is the time to come in and have a conversation with FDA. If we're talking study design, come in and talk to us about it, so that we're all on the same page when it comes to what types of studies you're doing, and how those studies should be conducted. So there aren't surprises on either side. Companies invest millions in doing these studies, and we want to make sure we're getting good bang for the buck when those studies are being conducted.
Well, I guess so, because for real-world evidence, it can be in many different forms and for many different purposes. But certainly, we have, substantial evidence. We are sort of making that decision on what gets on the market. Once it's on the market, with the exception of accelerated approval, we don't have any power to sort of reconfirm that this is effective. It's out there, it's going to be used, and if it's not effective and it's not in the right population, then there's harm from that. So, I know there's always this sort of push of we want to get this done faster and cheaper, but the other side of it is too. And if you think of real-world evidence, there's, if you're a practitioner and you have no idea, between two things, two different practices, and so you're either going to guess, but someone does, and this is done in certain healthcare systems, maybe they're going to look in their own records and look at their own patient data and look at how, one decision versus the other. Well, that might be, good enough now to rely on, because otherwise you've got nothing. But we're going to ask you to meet a standard that is for a regulatory decision that decides whether this drug gets to the market or not.
Yeah, so we do think about evidence as being regulatory grade, and in some cases maybe it's a higher level. I think it's more about fit for purpose. What's the question you're trying to answer? And that should apply regardless of whether it's a regulatory question, it's something on clinical practice, quality of care. It's all, what's the question you're going to answer, and how sufficiently robust does the evidence need to be? The other is, certainly from a regulatory standpoint, we don't look at real-world evidence, a clinical study in a vacuum. We look at the totality of the evidence. So in the device space, we learn a lot from non-clinical testing. So when we're making a decision, we've got all this non-clinical testing. We might have a real-world evidence study that's conducted, and we may have additional clinical data as well, or other studies that have been conducting, and it's the whole package put together that informs the decision-making. So when we think about a real-world evidence study, it's in the context of all the other evidence that we'll be looking at.
How do the three of you working together, you three organizations working together on the real-world evidence? Is it a formal process, or are you doing it your own thing separately?
Go ahead.
So in developing, our frameworks and our guidances, we have been working together with making sure that everyone is in the room as we talk about these topics. We have a group that's sort of constituted to think about RWE and policy, and it's both represented with CBER and CDRH, recognizing that we may use these data differently and we have different products, but we need to be talking. I mean, one of the first things we did was we harmonized on the definitions. When CDRH was coming out with their final guidance, we sat down with them before and sort of came up with definitions that we thought was harmonized. Baby steps, but that's the first step, right? Let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing across the agency, and we're continuing to keep that communication across all of the centers.
I don't know that I need to add much more to that. I guess, so the three centers are working together, and we've been doing that for quite a while already. So I think, boy, there's probably more work groups than we can sometimes keep up with. There's at least a half dozen or so going on, and there's representation from all three centers on those. And I would say, from the center-specific aspect, our goal obviously is to make sure our products issues and those specific issues and limitations sort of get funneled into any sort of discussions or any sort of documents that get developed. But again, I think we're all working together, and I think it's working out quite well.
And just to add on, I agree there are a number of things that we work on together, and we're also having some projects under the PCOR Trust Fund, projects that were funded. But it's also important to distinguish between working together versus taking harmonized approaches, because sometimes that doesn't make sense based upon the kind of medical product that we're dealing with. And in addition, the value at the FDA is that sometimes we do move off and do some different things at different times. It's kind of like the United States. So one of the great values in the U.S. is you have different states, and some of the times the states experiment with things, and if it works really well, it becomes federal policy. But you wouldn't do it nationally for starters. You try it out in a particular state, and that's not unusual at the FDA. There are plenty of things where each center might be moving forward in one area, the other is not, for a variety of reasons. And then we all learn from it, and then we adopt accordingly within our respective programs.
I said at the beginning of my talk at the last Academy of Medical Sciences workshop that we had the impression that the FDA were considerably ahead of the EMA in the thinking of the application of real-world evidence. Is this, I mean, I know each of you collaborate with the EMA, but is this your experience as well? Would you agree with this? Jeff?
Well, I don't know if I can comment ahead or not, but if we are, then look on the bright side. You saved a lot of money because we had to invest a lot to learn a lot, and then you can just take advantage of it.
Mr. Trump would like you to say that.
I'm not going to touch that at all.
I would say we're trying to also set up mechanisms so that we can speak with the EMA and share, and so we understand what you're doing, and you better understand what we're working on, including our demonstration projects.
I would just echo that we have discussions with the EMA. It's always hard to tell who's ahead on what. So I don't keep a scorecard, but I think we learn from each other, and we have calls with EMA at least on different product areas and pharmacovigilance once a month, at least on those cluster calls. And so there is open communication among organizations as well.
Okay, now we've got a queue. Greg, you're
Sure. So, hearing your presentations describing some of the work you're doing, especially related to developing infrastructure, and then thinking back to Hector's presentation earlier, the sporting analogy I would come up with is sort of, what I'm wondering, is there a real shift in FDA's role here from being a referee who watches the play and rules on it to then moving to be a coach? We're trying to make the play better, and then actually stepping on the field, as Hector has done, to become a starting player. And when people keep saying, tell us what to do, maybe you could say, watch us, we're doing it.
So I think the study that Hector did was very interesting. And, we've obviously built infrastructure in the safety. And, as part of this, as I think Bob said, we conduct a lot of the safety studies before we ask someone else. If it can't be conducted, then it may need to be done somewhere else in Sentinel. In terms of efficacy, I don't know if we're going to lead the way on everything. I think, there are certain things that we have done, and certainly the work that we've done illustrates some of the methods that we have some confidence in, and we're doing it as transparently as possible. But I do think, that's not going to be the primary role. We're not going to be on the field. We're still the receivers and trying to look at this critically and work together with those who are trying to bring the evidence to us. If you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll sort of echo the same types of comments, which is, Hector's done really great work. So I think there's a very good comfort, a reasonable comfort with doing safety studies. And so the effectiveness work, now that I look back, we're probably in it already 5 years. It was slow getting started, but I think, that work has really come along quite well. And so it is sort of setting a standard for the types of things we want to see in the future. And so are we sort of going to be doing that on a regular basis? I sort of agree with Jackie. We're hoping to sort of sit as much on the sidelines and be the referee rather than having to generate the data. Because these studies, as you can see, are fairly complex and take years to do. And so that would be my only cautionary note on the whole analogy.
And I think first I have to just say Hector. Everyone else is saying Hector, so I feel left out. Hector. Thank you, Hector. So I'd like to think that we're not only on the ball field playing, we actually own a team. And so, I mean, we have spent several years developing infrastructure with partners, conducting studies. We've gone further in some cases. You know, I mentioned the TVT registry. So in one example, the two healthcare professional societies sponsor, we're going to conduct a clinical trial on alternate access. We looked at the data in the registry, thought the data was sufficient to support the indication. We picked up the phone, we called the company and said, we'll approve it. Just send us the paperwork. Don't kill yourself over it. Just give us analysis. So rather than 1 to 2 years for the study and coming in the door, in a matter of a few weeks, we had an expanded indication.
Can I just add? So just keeping with that analogy, I think the analogy really is we're not buying the team. We're one team, and we're ready to vacate the field and let other teams come in and use that infrastructure and play on that field. So. That's really, I think, an important point to make.
Now we're back to Caddyshack. It's not just, see the ball, be the ball, right? We could go on all day with this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Luca Foschini, co-founder, Chief Data Scientist, Aviation Health. Thanks, the panel, for your remark. I was really glad to hear that there's this plan of creating this Office of Clinical Evidence that will kind of like try to aggregate evidence validation from clinical trials and real world. In my remarks yesterday, I had a slide that says like patient-generated health data blurs the line between clinical trials and real world, and so it's great to see that the agency is thinking in that direction as well. The question I wanted to ask is whether you have plans to include in that office among epidemiologists and biostatisticians, as you mentioned, also technologists that might have an understanding of how data from sensor is collected, and what if the missing data comes from an error in fetching from an API versus actually an unobserved confounder with the patient, and expert in machine learning that can help running analysis in such a large data sets where you need machines to make decisions as much as human. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Those folks are not in that office. We have people who are kind of spread out in the center with some of that expertise, and then we are trying to build up our expertise on machine learning or AI writ large, and that's not just from the standpoint of from data analysis, if you will, but from the standpoint of regulatory, because that's kind of in our bailiwick. But it's a really great point. It also goes to, we've talked so much about real-world data sources of, claims and electronic health records. We talk about data standards in those spaces. The other place where we have to tackle is data standardization for technologies that are gathering evidence, because it's all got to fit together.
Can I just make a plug also? I think, so my office has not only biostatisticians, medical officers who do review as well, but we also have a high-performance computing center. It's called the Hive. And what I will say is hiring positions like you're mentioning in machine learning, AR, are really difficult. And we're finding there's a lot of turnover in that space. And so if you get somebody trained up, then either a pharma company is going to come take them away, or a Google or an Amazon or somebody. So we're certainly open to references for good people, because we're always looking for them. So I'll put that plug in. Important to have those expertise on board.
My name is John Burcham with the Mid-America Angels Capital Network. I have a question about registries. Jeff, you mentioned several initiatives, I think, at CDRH relating to registries, and I didn't hear so much from the others. I guess I'm wondering really why registries are not a cross-FDA project. Because patients take drugs, take devices, and so on, and they're bound to show up in many, many registries. I do know that I think the FDA is funding a lot of work through NORD on rare disease registries. I was wondering what other initiatives, well, just a greater summary, if possible, on what the FDA as a whole is doing on relating to registries.
You're correct. We have funded a number of, we're working with NORD on their disease registries because of the need there to get these natural history studies. We haven't, there are certain registries in certain areas that are already in development, and it's not necessarily funded by us. With the device is a certain device. If you're going to do a whole disease registry, I think there's could be different types of who's going to make the investment. Is it going to be us? We may not be able to do that. We need someone to really invest in a larger registry. There are, registries in the cardiac space, not only with the devices and cardiac cath. There's bone marrow transplant registry, so there was an interest in systematically gathering that data. But I think it's difficult for us to know where do we first need, which is the diseases that we need the registry and who will fund it. But we would always be willing to talk to someone who wants to set up a registry to talk about what kind of data, if you're going to set up a registry and use that registry to then inform regulatory, what would be the kind of endpoints you might want to, or data you might be wanted to capture, so that would be most useful to us.
I can just mention a few things as far as registries for CBER products. So I know the hemophilia community has sort of hemophilia treatment centers, and so that's also engaged in a sort of a large patient registry, and that I believe has gone on for quite a while. And then there's other areas. So for instance, in the pancreatic islet cell area for treatment of brittle diabetes, NIH funds a registry as well. And so some of these activities are taken over by public entities as much as the companies. And so we have vaccine registries for several of those, especially those vaccines recommended for administration during pregnancy, but those are sort of more limited because the patient is, a limited 9-month period you're engaging them. But yeah, for us, I think the use of registries is far more limited than in other centers.
Your point was that you think that the FDA should be putting this together. Is that right?
Well, I guess that was a question I was wondering about. It seems, just as an observer in this whole space, it's great to be an outsider. I see a multiplicity of registries. I see a huge amount of redundancy and duplication of effort and all kinds of waste of effort. There are almost, it seems to me, a greater silo problem in the research field, the research registries now particularly, than there are, at least as bad, if not worse, as there are VHRs. The data is the research data is just increasingly siloed. A lot of the market for registry software vendors is estimated to be going from roughly around $400 or $500 million to over $2 billion in the next couple of years. Those are some market forecasts that I've seen, and that's telling us lots of things. But it's among other things telling us that there are too many silos. So someone ought to be coordinating these.
I do think part of the state of affairs we're in is due to both necessity and opportunism. For us, the necessity was that there hasn't been a unique device identifier initially and then not incorporated electronic health information, EHRs or claims. And so registries are the place where a good registry will know the device that was used, and particularly important as we have different, generations of the technology. You have the National Drug Code, and so some of the other sources are a little bit more ripe and a little higher confidence in the data. The other is the opportunism that Jackie was going to. Someone's got to pay for it. And in the case for devices, we've seen where healthcare professional societies want to better understand the care they're giving and improve care. The technology is part of the procedures they're doing, so they have to, and they're going to get data on the technologies. So that's driven some of the difference we've seen. Your point is spot on, because there's a lot of duplication and efficiency out there. The best of all possible worlds is that the term registry falls from the lexicon. And we ultimately deal with the issue with electronic health records, which many of them are not fit for purpose right now, and lots of inconsistencies and issues on linkages. But optimally, and this goes to redesign workflow, redesign the EHRs, link them up, have the data standards, so that's where we're getting our data from, rather than creating these artificial constructs called registries.
Yes, I'm Neil Belson with Potomac Law Group, and I have two questions, one a short one for Jeff and one a more general. The first is, when you gave that information, and I think I got it more or less correctly, that using the real-world evidence in several case examples had reduced the cost of clinical studies from a projected $134 million to $25 million. Is that a citation available or information available anywhere on your website, or is there where we can get sort of like a citation for it?
I never said that. That's fake news. We have a article that will be published and will be out there. It's not out there yet.
Okay, great. And then the more general question for all of you is data from the FDA Sentinel program, from the pending NEST program, and from other, from say NIH registries, is that something that you have in the past or in the future envision being able to accept as part for regulatory submission purposes? As supporting data similar to the company-generated product registries that you just mentioned, Jeff, for the transcatheter aortic valve replacement last year. Could some of these public databases be used for that same purpose if the data would be relevant?
Your last phrase, is the data relevant? And
I'm sorry?
data, I think your last phrase is key, right? Because data is data, evidence is something else. And so, when you're talking about, obviously, in the Sentinel system, we know how we curate that data. We know the quality of that data, that it doesn't mean it's fit to generate evidence. It has to be a question, and the analytics and everything around that. It is open to, we've created a mechanism through Reagan Udall for pharma to use it. They have used it on their own. They have submitted it for regulatory purposes, more in the sort of safety arena, and we're not closing the door on anything, but it all really boils down to these other discussions, is how are you going to use those data?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you.
Nothing to add.
Well, it was really great to hear about all the progress being made. A lot of things went through my mind about it, some really interesting questions I could ask, but I'll try to limit it to two real softball questions. There is so much progress being made, and yet there's a lot of heterogeneity within the FDA. I even heard yesterday there was a case of a company that worked in one part of the FDA and then took their findings forward into an advisory committee and were undermined by another part of the FDA that didn't agree with what Part A of the FDA did. And that kind of thing obviously crimps the interest of people that want to move things forward. So I wonder if, like this Center for Clinical Evidence, or whatever the construct is, if there's going to be some way for people to appeal when they, let's say, fall into the less advanced components of the FDA, to somehow service it without creating what the great fear is when people bring products forward, which is that they'll piss off the review teams and lose out, even if they think they're right. That's question one.
I'll say certainly for us, the journey on real-world evidence, it's still a journey. And within CDRH, we have different components in somewhat different places. So as part of this reorg, as we are now piloting in this new structure, is training on building better understanding of real-world data sources. And so I think what if you kind of look at the evolution of what's happened is our reliance, our engagement on the conduct of those kinds of studies has now expanded across different parts of the center. But that is a critical piece, is our vigilance for making sure all of our folks are on board, and that ultimately becomes part of the fabric, the culture of the center.
So obviously it's a big place, but we're doing our best to, actually we've set up a mechanism, whether we're 100% effective, that when a study comes in that is a real world evidence study and something novel, that it not only sits with the division, but that they bring it to a larger group and that we can have more shared learning and making those public. We're trying to do a lot of outreach as much as we can into the divisions to let them know what we are doing, what we're thinking about. So it's through internal scientific rounds and things like that. It may not be perfect, but we realize that, having 5 or 6 of us sitting around and talking isn't really the FDA. We have to get down and everyone has to be on board and be in agreement with what we're trying to do.
I'm not sure I can add much more, except to say I think of value too in these committees is that CBER can actually leverage what's going on at CEDAR because we sit in on a lot of those meetings, and it is early days for the real world evidence, but I think we learn a lot about what's going on at other centers, and then how they're approaching things, and then there's sort of more harmonization because you can sort of learn, lessons learned, and then apply those sort of more in a harmonious fashion, rather than sort of in this conflict.
Good. I mean, I think I heard all of you say that if people are bringing things forward and they sort of meet resistance, there actually is intended to be a mechanism to make it shared, as you said, before they get to the point where they've invested in a study or gotten down the road and then realize some other part that's going to be important doesn't agree. So that's very positive. The second question is relates to something that was discussed in pretty much detail yesterday, and that is, in every phase, the pre-approval time clock is getting shorter and shorter. Different kinds of data are being accepted, which means the post-approval part becomes much more important. And Alistair may want to comment on this too, but in EMA, there was this, between EMA and the health technology assessors, there's this joint advice component that may be moving along. In the U.S., you sort of run out, as you said, Jackie, you sort of run out of authority, and now you're in the CMS world. Is there anything going on right now within HHS between FDA and CMS to fill in this gap? Because we talked yesterday about, several people said, well, we do A, B, and C, and then there's a real need for D, E, and F, but it's not in our purview, and then no one's actually doing D, E, and F in most of the cases.
And I'm not privy to anything specific. That doesn't mean it's not going on, but
Okay.
I don't have anything that I can add that we're doing right now.
Because it's more than implicit in the CDRH, the stuff that I got to work on with Jeff, and then the continuation that, the life cycle of a device, the demarcation between pre and post market becomes less and less of a bright line. Just to suggest, I would hope there would be work across the sectors.
Can I come in on this? I think as you imply, Rob, the HTA is much more developed in Europe than it is in the United States. And regulation, I envisage regulation as safety, quality, and efficacy, traditional regulation, plus HTA. The two are a package together. And if you ask the man in the street why he can't get a drug or why he can get a drug, it's very often HTA causes rather than regulatory causes. And one of the without entering the Brexit debate again, if we in UK were to leave Europe, one of the positive sides of this, and Paul Johnson, if he's still here, may like to comment on this, is that there may well be a coming together of NICE and the MHRA, if not to form one organisation, at least to work much more closely together than the present.
That would be a really interesting model.
And I can see nothing but good in that.
Yeah. My final comment, I'm feeling cup half full today, but just hearing the progress since a couple of years ago, it's really quite remarkable. Things are moving along. I'm impatient, so I hope it'll move along faster, but thanks.
No, it's appropriate that Mark should ask the last question.
Yes, I think this will be the last one. You're cutting into my final comment time, but I'd rather hear from you all. So just one comment from me first on this issue of payers. I think that as this kind of infrastructure gets better developed and the cost of doing timely effectiveness studies on questions that matter to payers but that are hard to address in the pre-market context, it should get easier. You heard a little bit about this yesterday, and just as a reminder, in the cases where CMS has done coverage with evidence development, sometimes it's worked well, like in the TVT registry case. In many cases, there just hasn't been an infrastructure to take on the questions that CMS wanted to cover. And that hopefully is changing as a result of this effort. But I just wanted to end on keeping with Jeff's description of this as a journey. And these are not meant to be softball questions, but it is hard to do. And I'd like to ask each of you, if you had additional resources to help accelerate the journey from your side at the FDA, where would you put them? And then back to this group. You've got a group of researchers, industry experts, consumers, others who have thought about these issues a lot. What would you like them to focus more on? At least one key area, please.
So I think as far as areas, I think I will say above me and sort of, around my area and below me, which means I think we still need to kind of figure out the policy around all of this and what are some of the parameters for acceptance and use of real-world evidence in the regulatory setting. We have a nice start to it. It's still early in the journey. We've got a long way to go. But I think we've got to communicate that a lot of these discussions are happening in sort of the middle parts of the organization, higher levels, and we've got to sort of also bring in line into the conversation discussions with the reviewers, because that's really critical too. So they've got to really understand what's going on. And so that if I had additional resources, it would be sort of staff to really start communicating real-world evidence and what's happening throughout our entire organization. I think that's really critical for this to be a success and to sort of move forward as quickly as possible.
I think if we have more, we would do more of these demonstration projects and validation studies, so we really understand what these data are, what these methods are, and the more that we can do this in claims and EHRs across, the better off I think we'll be to understand, and so that we have a foundation of evidence for us to judge when the first thing, we know things are going to come in, and the more that we have now, or that we could explore the questions that we have, the better off I think we would be. If I wanted to say one thing that I think would be really helpful is if, the research and the care community, as you said, could really tackle this issue of, yes, we're gathering data at every visit, and yes, it is clinical data, and yes, it is relevant, but it's not necessarily relevant or in the kind of standard that we need so that you can do this efficiently, and we know that it's the same data. So I think bringing, the EHRs are why we're here. We wouldn't be here if people weren't using EHRs, because we've had claims for years. And so I think what we need to do is figure out how do you make those EHRs ready, so that we're not trying to figure out what did you have to do to clean it up, and is that algorithm machine learning what really work, or does it not work? If we had more confidence on how that data went in, it might be a little bit easier there.
So in terms of if we had additional data, we've sort of said in our medical device safety action plan that we've got data dollars. We have dollars that are going into NEST with a bigger focus on the pre-market side. And if we have the extra dollars, and this is part of a fiscal year 2019 budget proposal, some of that money is going to building out active surveillance capability, which device space, and I think drugs too, absolutely critical, and particularly if we're going to see more of this sort of products going to market with the shorter pre-market phase, you've got to have a very good post-market safety net. So that's one what I would like to see happen in the community, a big one. Adopt UDIs in electronic health information, absolutely essential. And then an opportunity for taking advantage of, I'd like to see more of leveraging the evidence that's being developed to generate objective performance criteria for mature technologies. It will streamline product coming to market. It's also going to give us better opportunities for doing comparative effectiveness, and I think just a better understanding of the technologies out there. And in the device space, particularly important, as I mentioned, these are iterative. So OPCs can be critically important in driving those iterations as well.